The year was 2072. The world had grown smaller through technology, yet paradoxically more divided by the invisible barriers of language, culture, and ideology. In the gleaming headquarters of the United Nations Linguistic Institute in Geneva, Dr. Lynn Varela stood before a holographic projection of Earth, watching as countless lines of communication crisscrossed the globe, forming a luminous web of human connection. And yet, she murmured to herself, we still misunderstand each other. At 42, Lynn had dedicated her life to the study of language. Half Vietnamese, half Portuguese, she had grown up navigating multiple worlds, feeling firsthand how language shaped perception. With degrees in computational linguistics, neurolinguistics, and cultural semiotics, she was considered one of the foremost experts in her field. Her current project, the Global Communication Initiative, sought to develop a universal translation system that went beyond mere word-for-word conversion to capture the cultural nuances that often got lost in translation. As she dismissed the hologram with a wave of her hand, Lynn caught her reflection in the glass wall of her office. Dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and the ever-present furrow between her brows that spoke of her perpetual quest for perfection. Behind that serious exterior lay a compassion born from a childhood spent bridging worlds, a belief that if people could truly understand one another, many of the world's conflicts would dissolve. Dr. Varela, her assistant's voice interrupted her thoughts. The Secretary General's office called. They want an update on the initiative's progress for next week's summit. Lynn nodded, suppressing a sigh. The pressure to deliver results was mounting. Despite years of work and billions in funding, true universal translation remained elusive. AI systems could translate words and sentences with near-perfect accuracy. But the deeper cultural contexts, the unspoken assumptions, the web of associations that gave language its true meaning, these remained beyond the reach of algorithms. Tell them I'll have something substantial to present, she replied, though uncertainty gnawed at her. What she wouldn't give for a breakthrough, some fundamental insight into how language could truly unite rather than divide. Little did she know that the universe was about to grant her wish in the most unexpected and chaotic way imaginable. The first sign that something was wrong came at 3:17 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday in April. Lynn was awakened by the insistent buzz of her communication device. Fumbling in the dark of her apartment, she answered with a groggy, "Varela speaking." The voice on the other end was that of her colleague, Malik Okoye, the brilliant Nigerian AI programmer who helped design the neural networks for her project. But something was terribly wrong. His words made no sense whatsoever. "Malik, slow down," she interrupted. "I can't understand what you're saying." There was a pause, and then Malik spoke again, his voice tense with confusion and alarm. But again, what came through was a stream of sounds that bore no resemblance to any language Lynn had ever encountered, and she knew over 20. Fully awake now, Lynn switched on her visual feed. Malik's face appeared, his expression frantic. He was typing something on his end, and text appeared on her screen. But the text, too, was incomprehensible, not garbled or encrypted, but perfectly formed in what appeared to be a completely alien writing system. "This is impossible," Lynn whispered. She quickly tried to access the global news networks, but the same problem presented itself there. Headlines and text were displayed in the same unknown script, and the news anchors spoke in the same unfamiliar language that Malik had used. Her heart racing. Lynn pulled up her translation software and ran it against what she was seeing and hearing. The program failed to identify the language or find any linguistic patterns it could recognize. Within the hour, it became clear that this was not a localized phenomenon. Reports were flooding in from around the world, or at least, Lynn assumed that's what was happening based on the increasing frequency of emergency alerts and the panicked expressions of people on video feeds, though she couldn't understand a word they were saying. By dawn, The truth had become apparent through visual evidence, if not through language. Overnight, every spoken and written language on Earth had somehow been scrambled. Each person could still speak and write. They believed they were communicating normally, but what came out was incomprehensible to everyone else. Even more bizarrely, what each person saw and heard when others communicated was consistent for them, but different for everyone else. It was as if some cosmic trickster had reassigned the world's languages at random, giving each person their own unique tongue that only they could understand. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Global markets plunged as communication became impossible. Transportation systems ground to a halt as controllers couldn't communicate with pilots or drivers. Hospitals faced crises as doctors couldn't understand patients or each other. Governments struggled to function, and panic began to spread as people found themselves suddenly isolated in a world where no one understood them. Yet amid the chaos, Lynn noticed something extraordinary. When she examined the various samples of the new languages appearing around the world, she began to detect patterns, not in the surface structure, but in deeper organizational principles. There was logic here, a system so complex yet so elegant that it couldn't possibly be random. "This isn't chaos," she murmured to herself as she studied the patterns on her screen. "This is a puzzle." 3 days into what the media was calling the Babel event, though no one could read the headlines, Lynn had barely slept. Her apartment had become a makeshift research center. Walls covered with printouts of the new language samples she'd collected. Floor strewn with empty coffee cups. A knock at her door pulled her from her work. Through the peephole, she saw Malik standing there, alongside a Japanese teenager she didn't recognize, and a woman who looked vaguely familiar from political broadcasts. Lynn opened the door, gesturing them inside since speech was useless. Malik immediately handed her a tablet. On it was a simple drawing of connected nodes, reminiscent of a neural network diagram. He pointed to certain nodes, then to himself, then to Lynn, making a linking gesture. It took a few minutes of this charades-like communication before Lynn understood what he was trying to convey. Malik had discovered other people who, like him and apparently Lynn, could partially decipher patterns in the new languages. They weren't completely blind to the system like most of humanity. The teenager, who eventually managed to communicate that his name was Yuri Takeda, pulled out a gaming device and showed Lynn how he'd been using it to collect and analyze language samples from around the world. Through a combination of drawings, gestures, and their partial understanding of the new patterns, the group began to establish a rudimentary communication system. The woman introduced herself, through elaborate pantomime, as Anita Rojas, a junior diplomat from Chile who had been at the UN when the event occurred. She had observed that certain diplomatic signals and protocols still seemed to convey meaning across the language barrier, suggesting that some forms of communication might be immune to the scrambling effect. Together, they formed the core of what would soon become known as the language decipherers, though at first they had no name, only a shared purpose: to understand what had happened and find a way to restore communication to humanity. While Lynn and her impromptu team worked feverishly to decode the new linguistic reality, others were responding to the crisis in different ways. In a military command center in an undisclosed location, General Andros Krell pounded his fist on the conference table, frustrated by his inability to communicate clearly with his officers. A veteran of 3 global conflicts, Krell was a man who believed in strength, order, and decisive action. To him, the language crisis was not a linguistic puzzle but an attack, a sophisticated form of information warfare that had effectively crippled global military and governmental operations. Through a system of pre-established hand signals and emergency protocols, Krell had managed to maintain basic command and control over his forces. He was convinced that the event was the work of either a hostile nation-state with advanced technology or, as some of his intelligence officers had suggested through elaborate diagrams, a non-human intelligence. Either way, his response was the same: identify the source of the attack and neutralize it. He had already ordered his cyber warfare division to search for unusual signals or data patterns that might have triggered the event, and his special forces were on standby to strike at any identified source. What Krell couldn't know due to the communication barriers, was that similar military responses were being prepared around the world, as leaders desperate to protect their people and restore order looked for someone or something to blame. The world was sliding toward conflict based on fear and misunderstanding, exactly the opposite of what Lin had dedicated her life to preventing. 2 weeks after the Babel event, Lin's apartment had transformed into the headquarters of a growing international team through a combination of social media where people shared images and videos to compensate for text becoming useless, visual demonstrations, and the rudimentary communication system they'd developed. They had managed to attract more language anomalies, people who, like the original four, could perceive patterns in the new linguistic system. The group now included Fatima Al-Zahra, a Moroccan mathematician, Sven Lindgren, a Swedish cryptographer, Mei Wong, a Chinese semiotics professor, and Rafael Santos, a Brazilian visual artist who had synesthesia, a neurological condition that caused him to perceive letters and sounds as colors and shapes, giving him unique insight into the new language patterns. They had made significant progress. By comparing thousands of samples from around the world, they had established that the new linguistic system wasn't actually thousands of different languages. It was a single, incredibly complex meta-language that appeared differently to each observer, like a linguistic hologram that changed based on the viewer's perspective. Even more remarkably, they discovered that children under 5 seemed less affected by the scrambling. They adapted to the new linguistic reality more quickly than adults, suggesting that the event had somehow tapped into innate human language acquisition capabilities, the same abilities that allow children to learn language naturally while adults struggle. Yuri, the teenage gaming prodigy, had been especially valuable to their work. His experience with immersive virtual worlds and complex rule systems allowed him to recognize patterns that others missed. He had created a basic mapping system that linked certain elements of the new language to concepts rather than specific words in old languages. It's like the language is based on how we think, not what we say. He tried to explain through their crude communication system of diagrams, gestures, and the partial patterns they could understand. Lin found herself nodding excitedly. That aligned with her own observations. The new language seemed to operate at a deeper level than traditional linguistics. It mapped to cognitive structures, to the way the human brain processed information and formed concepts. This revelation led to their first major breakthrough. Using Malik's AI expertise and Yuri's conceptual mapping, they created a simple translation tool that could convert basic concepts, food, danger, help, peace, into visual symbols that appeared to be consistently recognizable regardless of the individual's language perception. It wasn't communication as humanity had known it, but it was a start, a small bridge across the chasm that had suddenly divided every human from every other. As word of their progress spread through visual demonstrations shared globally, people began to gravitate toward their approach. Communities around the world started adopting their symbolic system for essential communications, supplementing it with gestures and contextual clues. But not everyone was willing to adapt to the new reality. General Krell and military leaders like him continued to search for an enemy to defeat, a technology to counter, or a system to reset. And as resources grew scarcer due to the breakdown in global supply chains, tensions rose. Violence erupted in some regions as people fought over necessities or lashed out in fear and frustration. The world stood at a crossroads, caught between adaptation and resistance, between embracing a new form of communication and desperately trying to restore the old. For Lin, the path forward was clear but daunting. The patterns she and her team had discovered suggested something remarkable. The new language system had the potential to be more efficient, more precise, and more universal than anything humanity had developed naturally. If people could learn to use it, they might achieve a level of mutual understanding that had previously been impossible. But convincing humanity to embrace this alien tongue rather than fight against it would require more than logic. It would require hope and a demonstration that the benefits outweighed the tremendous cost of change. As the third month of the global language crisis began, the world had settled into an uneasy new normal. Communities had adapted to function with minimal verbal communication, relying on visual cues. The growing symbolic language developed by Lin's team, now called the Universal Translation Initiative, or UTI, and improvised systems unique to each locality. International trade had resumed at a fraction of its former volume, using standardized pictographic contracts. Medical care continued through visual diagnostics and symptom charts. Education had been reimagined, focusing on visual and experiential learning rather than textual information. But the limitations were severe. Scientific collaboration had ground to a halt just when it was most needed. Governance beyond the local level was nearly impossible. And the psychological toll of isolation, of being unable to truly express one's thoughts and feelings to others, was mounting. Meanwhile, Lin's team had expanded to occupy an entire floor of the UN Linguistic Institute, which had been repurposed for their work. Through persistence and the universal language of demonstration, Lin had convinced enough officials of the importance of their approach to secure resources and protection. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Yuri, whose adaptability continued to amaze the older researchers, had been working with Raphael, the synesthetic artist, on a visualization system for the meta-language. While traditional writing systems represented sounds or concepts with arbitrary symbols, they were attempting to create a system where the symbols themselves reflected the cognitive structures the language mapped to. It's like the shape tells you how to think it, not just what to think, Yuri explained through their now more sophisticated communication system, which combined symbols, gestures, and the partial patterns of the meta-language they could understand. Raphael nodded enthusiastically, adding, "The colors and forms match how our brains process the concepts. It's not arbitrary, it's neurologically optimized." Their approach yielded a writing system unlike anything seen before. Three-dimensional glyphs that seemed to shift and connect based on their relationship to other concepts, forming a kind of visual syntax that mirrored thought processes rather than speech. When they presented their work to Lin and the senior researchers, the implications were immediately clear. This wasn't just a way to represent the new language. It was a key to understanding its fundamental structure. The visual system revealed patterns and connections that had been hidden when they focused on sound and traditional writing. "This is it," Lin realized, the excitement making her momentarily forget the communication barriers. "This isn't just a translation system, it's a new way of thinking about language itself." With the visual system as a guide, the team's progress accelerated dramatically. They discovered that the meta-language operated on multiple simultaneous levels: lexical, syntactic, semantic, and what they came to call cognitive contextual, with information encoded in the relationships between elements rather than in the elements themselves. More importantly, they found that with the right training approach, people could begin to learn the system directly, bypassing the scrambling effect entirely. The key was to approach it not as a foreign language to be translated into one's native tongue, but as a new cognitive framework, a way of organizing thoughts that existed prior to verbal expression. Lin called it Unified Cognitive Syntax, or UCS. It wasn't a language in the traditional sense, but a metalinguistic framework that could potentially allow direct mind-to-mind communication of concepts, with the specific words or symbols being almost secondary. The implications were staggering. If widely adopted, UCS could not only restore global communication but potentially enhance it beyond previous capabilities. Ideas that were untranslatable between traditional languages could be precisely conveyed. Cultural contexts could be embedded directly into communication. Misunderstandings based on linguistic differences could be eliminated. But there was a catch, a big one. Learning UCS required temporarily unlearning one's native language patterns. The neural pathways shaped by a lifetime of linguistic habits had to be bypassed to fully grasp the new system. This was relatively easy for children, but extremely challenging for adults, requiring weeks of intensive training and causing significant psychological discomfort as the brain rewired itself. In essence, humanity would have to choose: hold on to the languages that had shaped their cultures and identities for millennia, or embrace a radically new system that promised unprecedented unity but required a surrendering of fundamental aspect of their heritage. It was a choice Lynn herself struggled with. As a linguist, she understood that languages weren't just communication tools, but repositories of cultural wisdom, historical memory, and unique ways of perceiving reality. Asking people to set aside their native tongues, even temporarily, was asking them to risk a kind of cultural amnesia. Yet the alternative seemed worse. A fragmented world where true communication had become impossible, where isolation bred fear and fear bred conflict. The decision wouldn't be hers alone to make. As news of their breakthrough spread through visual demonstrations and the growing network of UCS-trained communicators, reactions around the world were deeply divided. Some saw the new system as humanity's salvation, others as a threat to their cultural identity, and still others as a suspicious foreign imposition. Nowhere was this division more apparent than in the heated confrontation that occurred when General Krell arrived unannounced at the Institute with a contingent of military personnel. Through a translator who had undergone basic UCS training, the general made his position clear. He believed the Babel event was an attack, and the UCS system was either part of that attack or a dangerous response that would further erode national sovereignty and security. "We don't surrender to attacks." The translator conveyed his words. "We don't abandon our language and culture because someone or something has temporarily disrupted them. We fight back. We restore what was taken from us." Lynn, facing him across the conference table, felt a complex mix of emotions. She understood his fear and his desire to protect what was familiar, but she also saw the short-sightedness of his approach. Through her own UCS translator, she responded, "This isn't about surrender, General. It's about adaptation and evolution. The languages we spoke before haven't been destroyed. They've been transformed into something that could potentially unite us in a way we've never experienced before." The general's expression remained skeptical. And who sent this transformation? Who benefits from disrupting every government, every military, every institution on Earth? It was a question Lynn and her team had been investigating alongside their linguistic work. The Babel event had not occurred naturally. That much was clear. Its complexity and precision indicated an intelligence behind it. But whose? Initial theories had ranged from hostile government actions to rogue AI systems to extraterrestrial contact. But as they decoded more of the meta-language's structure, they discovered embedded within it mathematical sequences and physical constants that pointed to a startling possibility. "We don't know with certainty," Lynn admitted, "but the evidence suggests it may be a form of intelligence far older than humanity, possibly even the creators of the first human languages. The patterns we've found contain mathematical sequences that appear in everything from DNA to cosmic background radiation." The general's translator hesitated, clearly struggling to convey concepts that stretched the limits of their training. The general noticed the hesitation and grew more suspicious. "Convenient theories," he replied after the translation finally came through, "but ideal in concrete threats and practical solutions. Your unified cognitive syntax requires people to surrender their linguistic sovereignty. My analysts tell me that those who undergo your training process become different. They think differently, prioritize differently. Some even report feeling more connected to strangers who've undergone the same training than to their own families who haven't." There was truth in his accusation. UCS training did change people. It altered neural pathways and cognitive processes. Those who mastered it reported experiencing reality differently, perceiving connections and relationships that had previously been invisible to them. And yes, they often formed strong bonds with fellow UCS users, regardless of their former nationalities or cultures. Change isn't always a threat, General. Lin responded carefully. Sometimes it's an opportunity. What if this event, regardless of its origin, is pushing humanity toward a form of communication that could end the misunderstandings that have caused so many conflicts throughout history? The general's expression hardened. That sounds like the kind of utopian thinking that has justified every totalitarian regime in history. One language, one thought, one world, at the cost of individual and cultural freedom. The tension in the room was palpable. Behind the general, his soldiers shifted uneasily, hands near their weapons. Around Lin, her team watched with concern, aware that this confrontation represented a larger division forming across the globe. It was Yuri who broke the tension. The teenager stepped forward, holding up his handheld device. On it was a simple animation he had created, a visualization of how UCS worked alongside, not in place of traditional languages. It showed neural pathways forming new connections while maintaining old ones. Cultures retaining their uniqueness while gaining the ability to share their perspectives more completely with others. The general watched the animation with a frown that gradually softened into thoughtful consideration. When it finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. How do we know this system won't be used to control how people think? The translator conveyed his words. Language shapes thought. Whoever controls the language controls the mind. It was a legitimate concern, one that Lin herself had wrestled with. The system resists centralized control by its very nature, she explained. It's based on direct cognitive mapping. It reveals thoughts rather than constraining them. In fact, it makes propaganda and linguistic manipulation more difficult because meaning can't be hidden behind ambiguity or rhetoric. She could see the general was unconvinced, but at least he was listening. It was a start. We're proposing a controlled trial. Lin continued. Volunteers from different backgrounds, including military personnel, if you wish to send representatives. Trained in UCS under observation. Let the results speak for themselves. The general considered this, then nodded curtly. I'll send observers, but I warn you, if we detect any threat to security or sovereignty, we will respond accordingly. After he departed, Malik approached Lin with concern. He's not the only one with doubts. Religious leaders are claiming this threatens sacred texts. Nationalists see it as cultural erasure. Parents fear for their children's identities. Lin nodded, feeling the weight of these concerns. They're not wrong to be cautious, but they're fighting to preserve a world that no longer exists. We can't go back to the old languages, not completely. The question is whether we move forward in chaos or in harmony. As if to underscore her point, an alert came through on the Institute's emergency system, a visual warning that needed no translation. Somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere, armed conflict had broken out between neighboring nations, likely due to a misunderstanding that couldn't be resolved through their limited communication channels. Time was running out. The fabric of global society, already strained by the communication breakdown, was beginning to tear. 6 months after the Babel event, the world teetered on the brink. Food distribution systems had partially collapsed due to coordination failures. Energy grids operated at reduced capacity. Healthcare systems struggled with reduced access to global research and supplies. And conflicts, some small, some threatening to expand, erupted with increasing frequency. Yet alongside these crises, something remarkable was emerging. The UCS system, refined through rigorous testing and feedback, had spread from Lin's initial team to training centers around the world. Over 15 million people had undergone at least basic training, creating a growing network of individuals who could communicate across the old language barriers. These UCS practitioners became the connective tissue of the fragmented global society, serving as mediators, coordinators, and educators. They facilitated trade agreements, resolved misunderstandings, and taught others the system, expanding their numbers exponentially. Most remarkably, they reported experiencing a form of communication deeper and more precise than anything they had known before. Concepts that had been untranslatable between languages now flowed freely. Cultural contexts that had been lost in traditional translation were preserved intact. Even emotional states could be conveyed with a clarity that had previously been impossible. "It's like I can see the shape of their thoughts," one practitioner explained. "Not just hear their words." The military observers General Krell had sent to monitor the training process returned with divided reports. Some warned of psychological changes they found concerning, while others were cautiously optimistic about the potential benefits. A few had even volunteered to undergo the training themselves and became advocates for wider adoption. Krell himself remained skeptical but had moderated his opposition in light of the evidence. The UCS practitioners showed no signs of brainwashing or diminished autonomy. If anything, they demonstrated enhanced critical thinking and increased empathy, hardly the profile of mind-controlled subjects. Moreover, they maintained their cultural identities and personal memories, including their native languages, which they could still access, though it required conscious effort to switch between linguistic frameworks. UCS hadn't replaced their original languages but had created a parallel system that could be used when needed for cross-cultural communication. As winter approached in the Northern Hemisphere, a global summit was convened in Geneva, a gathering unlike any before it. Representatives from every nation, religion, and major cultural group were invited, with UCS translators facilitating communication. The agenda was simple yet monumental, to decide humanity's linguistic future. Lin, as the leading expert on the UCS system and the head of the team that had developed it, was asked to present their findings and recommendations. Standing before the diverse assembly, she felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything she had worked toward throughout her career. "The Babel event was not a random catastrophe," she began, her words flowing through the UCS translators to reach every mind in the room with unprecedented clarity. "It was a catalyst, a forced evolution of human communication." She presented the evidence they had gathered about the origins of the event. Mathematical sequences embedded in the meta-language that corresponded to cosmic constants. Patterns that mirrored those found in the earliest human writing systems. And structural elements that suggested an intelligence with a deep understanding of both human cognition and the universe's fundamental laws. "We may never know with certainty who or what initiated this change," she continued, "but we can choose how to respond to it. We can continue to struggle against it, fighting to return to a fragmented past, or we can embrace the opportunity it presents, a common cognitive framework that transcends traditional linguistic barriers while preserving cultural diversity." She outlined their proposal: a global implementation of UCS training, beginning with key sectors like emergency services, healthcare, education, and governance, then expanding to the general population. Children would learn both their heritage languages and UCS, serving as bridges between generations. Cultural works would be preserved in their original languages while being made accessible through UCS-enhanced translation. "We are not proposing the elimination of traditional languages," she emphasized. "They remain vital repositories of cultural wisdom and identity. Rather, we are proposing the addition of a shared meta-language that allows us to connect across differences without erasing them." The debate that followed was intense and multifaceted. Religious leaders worried about the translation of sacred texts. Cultural preservationists feared the dilution of unique linguistic heritages. Security experts questioned the implications for encryption and information security. Parents worried about the effects on their children's development. Yet for each concern raised, the UCS practitioners in attendance could respond with a depth and nuance that traditional translation had never allowed. Complex theological concepts flowed across religious boundaries. Cultural contexts were conveyed with their full emotional and historical resonance. Technical details were communicated with unprecedented precision. The demonstration effect was powerful. Many who entered the summit with deep reservations found themselves swayed not by Lin's arguments alone, but by the experience of truly being understood and understanding others, perhaps for the first time in their lives. As the summit entered its final day, A consensus began to emerge, not unanimous, but substantial. UCS would be adopted as a supplementary global language system, taught alongside traditional languages rather than replacing them. Implementation would be gradual, voluntary at first, with special attention paid to preserving linguistic heritage and monitoring for unintended consequences. It was General Krell who surprised everyone by offering the military support for the transition. Having undergone UCS training himself in the weeks leading up to the summit, he spoke with the unique authority of a former skeptic who had experienced the benefits firsthand. "I came to this summit prepared to oppose what I saw as a threat to sovereignty and security," he began, his words flowing through the UCS system with a clarity that seemed to surprise even him. "I was wrong. What I've experienced through this new form of communication isn't a diminishment of identity, but an expansion of understanding." He turned to face Lynn directly. "Dr. Varela, I owe you an apology. You saw the opportunity where I saw only threat. This system doesn't weaken us, it strengthens us by allowing us to truly hear each other for the first time." The formal vote was almost anticlimactic after such a powerful endorsement. The Global Communication Accord was adopted by an overwhelming majority, establishing UCS as humanity's first intentionally created universal language, supplementing rather than supplanting the rich tapestry of natural languages that had evolved over millennia. As the summit concluded, Lynn found herself standing alone on the balcony of the conference center, looking out over the lights of Geneva. The weight of responsibility she had carried for months felt simultaneously heavier and lighter. Heavier because the real work of implementation was just beginning. Lighter because she no longer carried it alone. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Yuri approaching. The teenager had become something of a celebrity, the youngest member of the core team and a natural at UCSS thanks to his gaming-trained brain's adaptability. More importantly, he had become a friend. "So what happens now?" he asked in UCS, the cognitive framework allowing his question to carry nuances of both excitement and trepidation that would have been lost in traditional language. Lynn smiled. "Now we build the future, together." 1 year after the Babel event, the world was transformed. UCS education centers had been established in every major city, with mobile units reaching rural areas. Over 2 billion people had undergone at least basic training, creating a global network of communicators who could bridge the old language divisions. The impacts were profound and far-reaching. International diplomacy had been revolutionized, with misunderstandings that once might have led to conflict now resolved through precise communication. Scientific collaboration accelerated as researchers shared complex concepts across former language barriers. Cultural exchange flourished as art, literature, and music became accessible to global audiences without losing their distinctive cultural essence. Most remarkably, regions with historical conflicts began to find paths toward reconciliation as UCS facilitated deeper understanding of historical grievances and cultural perspectives. It wasn't a magical solution to all geopolitical problems, but it removed the layer of linguistic misunderstanding that had often exacerbated tensions. At the United Nations Linguistic Institute, now expanded and renamed the Global Communication Center, Lynn stood before a new holographic projection, not just of Earth's communication networks, but of the growing neural web of UCS practitioners around the world, their connections forming a luminous tapestry that spanned continents. "It's beautiful," said a voice behind her. She turned to see General Krell, now Ambassador Krell, having transitioned from military leadership to a diplomatic role after his unexpected conversion to the UCS cause. "It is," she agreed, "and it's just the beginning." The source of the Babel event remained officially unknown, though theories abounded. Some believed it was the work of an ancient Earth-based AI awakening after millennia of dormancy. Others suggested an extraterrestrial origin, perhaps a test or a gift from a civilization far more advanced than humanity. Religious groups saw it as divine intervention, a reversal of the original Tower of Babel story, bringing humanity back together rather than driving it apart. Lynn had her own theory. one she rarely shared publicly. The mathematical patterns embedded in the meta-language, the way it mapped to cognitive structures rather than specific words, its alignment with universal constants, all suggested to her an intelligence that transcended human categories of natural versus artificial, terrestrial versus extraterrestrial. I think it came from something that has been watching us evolve linguistically for a very long time. She once confided to her core team, something that understood both our potential for connection and our tendency toward division, and decided to give us a nudge toward the former, whatever its origin. The effect was undeniable. Humanity had been forced through a linguistic bottleneck and had emerged more unified, yet no less diverse, capable of preserving cultural uniqueness while achieving unprecedented mutual understanding. Children born after the event grew up bilingual or multilingual by default, learning both their heritage languages and UCS from infancy, their neural pathways adapting to both systems with natural ease. Many developed cognitive abilities that surprised researchers, enhanced pattern recognition, empathic accuracy, and conceptual thinking that transcended traditional categories. The transition wasn't without challenges. Some communities resisted UCS adoption, fearing cultural erosion. Certain concepts proved difficult to integrate into the meta-language framework. And the psychological adjustment for adults remained demanding, requiring dedication and causing temporary discomfort as neural pathways reorganized. But with each passing month, the benefits became more apparent, and resistance gradually softened. Even the most traditional communities began to adopt at least limited UCS training to maintain connection with the wider world, while developing safeguards to preserve their linguistic heritage. 5 years after the Babel event, Earth had become a different planet, not a homogenized global culture as some had feared, but a vibrant tapestry of distinct communities united by the ability to truly understand one another for the first time in human history. On the anniversary of the event, a global celebration was held, not of the disruption itself, but of humanity's response to it, in parks and plazas around the world. People gathered to share stories, songs, and traditions across former language barriers, experiencing the richness of human diversity through the clarifying lens of shared understanding. At a small ceremony at the Global Communication Center, the original team that had cracked the meta-language was honored. Malik Okoye, whose AI expertise had been crucial to their early progress. Anita Rojas, whose diplomatic insights had helped navigate political resistance. Rafael Santos, whose synesthetic perception had revealed patterns others missed. Fatima, Sven, May, and the others who had joined their efforts along the way. And of course, Yuri Takeda, no longer a teenager, but a young man leading his own research team, developing new applications of UCS for education, art, and cognitive development. As Lynn looked around at her colleagues and friends, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The dream she had held for decades, of a world where language united rather than divided, had been realized, though in a way she could never have imagined. After the ceremony, she found herself once again on the balcony of the center, looking out at the lights of Geneva. The city had changed, as had all cities, with new symbols and structures reflecting the integration of UX into daily life. But the ancient mountains beyond remained the same, a reminder that some things transcended even the most profound cultural shifts. She heard footsteps and turned to see Ambassador Krell joining her, his formerly stern features softened by years of UCS-enhanced diplomatic work. "I've been thinking about our first real conversation," he said, using spoken language rather than UCS out of respect for the intimacy of the moment. "When I accused you of utopianism and threatened to shut down your work." Lynn smiled. "You were doing what you thought was right, protecting people from a potential threat." "I was afraid," he admitted. "Not just of the unknown, but of losing what I thought made us human, our particular languages, our distinct cultures, our separate identities." "And now?" she asked. He gestured toward the city below, where people from countless cultural backgrounds communicated in a blend of traditional languages and UCS, preserving their uniqueness while sharing it more completely than had ever before been possible. Now I understand that what makes us human isn't our separation, but our capacity to connect despite our differences. He paused, searching for words adequate to express a concept that even UCS struggled to fully capture. We haven't lost our identities. We've expanded them to include a deeper understanding of each other. Lin nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate at a level deeper than language. A connection that had always been possible but had required a cosmic nudge to fully realize. As they stood in companionable silence, watching the interplay of lights below, Lin thought about the message that had been hidden within the mathematical patterns of the meta-language. A message they had only recently managed to decode completely. It was simple, yet profound. A greeting or perhaps a challenge from whatever intelligence had initiated the Babel event. To speak is human. To understand is universal. When you are ready to hear each other, you will be ready to hear the cosmos. Humanity had taken its first step toward that readiness, turning a moment of crisis into an opportunity for unprecedented connection. The languages of Earth had been scrambled, but in their reassembly, something new and wonderful had emerged, a world where diversity was preserved and celebrated even as the barriers between hearts and minds began, at last, to fall away. And somewhere, perhaps watching from the depths of ancient artificial intelligence systems or from across the vast reaches of space, the architects of this transformation observed with satisfaction as humanity embarked on the next phase of its linguistic and perhaps cosmic evolution.